Hi, my name is Mackenzie Olson, and this is my final presentation for Info 362. So this is the overall agenda of what I'm going to be discussing. These are some main topics that we've worked on learning throughout our time this quarter, and I'm going to be viewing them all through the lens of my final infographic, which is about CTE in football players. CTE is a type of brain injury that happens from chronic repetitive brain trauma. So it's of course not limited to just football players, but given that the industry makes so much money and such a high percentage of the players walk away with this chronic lifetime injury by the time they're done playing at 30, 35, I thought it was an interesting topic to dive into. So we're going to talk initially about visual potential, and there's 5 main forms. It was one of the first topics we covered this quarter. Let's start with location. So visual potential is all about how we can interact with data. Some data really lends itself well to seeing it in a visual form, like something like CTE, whereas other data, I think the example Marilyn provided us was a little paragraph about prerequisite courses to get into informatics or what informatics is, and while very informative, there's not a lot of imagery or categorization or really graphics you can think of for a topic like that. So circling back, visual potential, specifically looking at location. So we want to convey information about the location of various football positions. So I could have, had 11 different small paragraphs discussing what the player does, where they're found on the field, maybe the history of the position, but that wasn't really what I wanted to convey to the users because they have limited time. I really wanted to just show them, hey, this is where the positions are relative to each other. So the best way of doing this was making an area chart that was resembling a football field, and you can see I have various positions on here, and that's basically what I want the user to take away. So this is really supposed to be catering towards someone who might not know a lot about football, so they have no idea where alignment is with respect to a quarterback or a running back or a wide receiver. But now, thanks to this area chart, those words don't just mean nothing. They can visualize and see where they are in proximity to the other positions. Another type of visual potential is numbers. So frequency, percentage, looking at whole distributions, so the relationships of numbers to one another. Here I'm using the same chart, and instead of focusing on where the positions are relative to each other, I want the user to focus on how large or what percentage of the players in that position are suffering from CTE. So you can see I've included a little percentage below, and now they can see that linemen have a much higher rate of getting CTE compared to something like a punter or a place kicker. Another type of visual potential is appearance. So this is one of the first graphics on my infographic, and I wanted to convey to the user the difference between a normal brain and a brain of someone who has CTE. So again, I could have gone through the process of writing a long-winded paragraph about what gray matter is versus white matter is, the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, dendrites, myelin sheaths, that decay, which honestly I would love to do. I love neurobiology, but in terms of a quick salient infographic, it's not the appropriate time or place. So that's where using the visual potential of information like that and just including images does a better job. So you can see a normal brain on the left, like I said, and then the decay and what's happening, and you can walk away and say, wow, CTE isn't just, getting headaches or having a concussion. It's real impact on the human brain, and you can see it right here. Another type of visual potential is the relationships. So here I have relationships between 4 main stages of CTE, starting with the first and ending with the fourth. So here I have decided to stack them from stage 1 being at the top and stage 4 being at the bottom, and include supplementary information about the different stages and what distinguishes them, specifically kind of like what are the new marked symptoms, the hallmark symptoms at stage 2, which lets you know that you have arrived. So a lot of information lends itself really well to that. Marilyn in her example talked about, I think she had tigers and the different types of big cat species and the relationship to one another. So it's really just another way of adding a visual element to something that could be explained in a couple of paragraphs, but might be more meaningful to the user in a visual, more digestible form. Lastly, the last form of visual potential being time. So here I wanted to examine the participation of youth in football over time as it becomes more and more commonplace that it tends to be a more dangerous sport. And so here on the bottom, I have a timeline, and you can see a general trend downwards very clearly across the decade, which might be more poignant to the user instead of reading XY pairs. Like in 2008, there was 1.1 million players, and now in 2017, there's 1.03. Like, great, but those are such large numbers, I can't see it. And wait, you said 2008 versus 2014. Like, that's a lot of information for the user to hold in his head. So why don't we kind of exploit the fact that this information can be represented in a visual form and put it in something as simple as a line chart. Here, I guess I'll talk about this a little bit in coding, but I did a little bit of double encoding with the size on the pointers as well, but I can talk about my overall decision to do that later on. We'll get to it. Encoding. So the first type of encoding that I really did was using color. So I often just used it to distinguish from one category to the next. There is no thematic teal means this throughout my entire infographic. That wasn't something that was really done in my visual language model, and thus I didn't really employ it in mine either. But here you can see just the black and the yellow are distinguishing in this bar chart from the two different categories, the teal, the gray, the orange, the yellow. Here we have teal distinguishing from orange, offensive from defensive. And then here it's a bit more subtle. We go from stage 1 to stage 4. And I just have the darkening stages of teal trying to just signify to the user, okay, stage 1 is one of the better stages. It's preliminary. Stage 4 is the most serious, dark, sad. We kind of associate those colors together. Another type of encoding that I did was size. So you can see here that the larger the marker, the more players have CTE. So that's a quick way for the users to go and look and say, oh, hey, punters are so small compared to linemen. I can tell this position must involve a lot of contact, and thus that's why the players are more likely to get CTE. Another place I used encoding for size was, I'll skip back for you here. So 2008, I'm encoding the larger marker means 1.1 million, and the smaller marker means 1.03. Typically, in something like a line chart, you don't want to encode with size on top of the line chart because it's like a double message, and the individual viewing it might get kind of confused, like, oh, does size signify something else? Because they're already assuming that the main point has been gotten across with the trend. I decided to include it anyway because the discrepancy between 1.1 million and 1.03 seems really small because I tried to avoid using lots of decimal places and digits. And so just having a bigger marker versus a smaller marker was kind of a way of making up for that and showing, hey, look at, 1.1 million with respect to 1.03. You can see it's decreased in size quite a bit. And I didn't get any critiques complaining about the double encoding in this. So it is a violation, but I think overall it is a net positive, so that's why I chose to keep it. Moving forward, we'll discuss color. So here I kind of just pulled out a little bit of a color palette for you. You can see the 5 main colors I've used prominent across my entire graphic. You can see that I've really used it to highlight the more interesting parts, or really the more visually appealing parts, so you can immediately be drawn to the brain, which is one of the big points I wanted the user to take away was, wow, look at what a normal brain looks like versus a CTE brain. I wanted them to look at the different positions on the field and see how some are much more dangerous than others. I was hoping the stages would catch people's eye, just because I think this is a really visually appealing part. But anyway, you can see that I'm trying to draw the user's attention with the color. Encoding is leveraged, like I said before, to kind of separate different components within an individual infographic, so offense versus defense, but there's no high-level black bar charts mean this. It's just I'm operating within the subset of colors I was given, and I'm having variety in there so it doesn't become monotonous. Kind of same concept with associations, so I'm not trying to create an overall theme about yellow meaning brains. It's just a color that's used throughout. In terms of tone, I emulated the color model, and I'm hoping it gives kind of like a formal and sporty feel. To me personally, these colors remind me of jerseys or turf, or the cones associated with being on a sports field. So I feel like they are very on theme, more or less. In terms of color harmony, which is a concept we've gone over a little bit, the closest I can get to applying the new vocabulary we've picked up across the quarter is that I feel like this orange color and this teal color are coming very close to being complementary on the wheel. They're not exactly 180, but they're close. I know oranges and blues tend to be complementary colors. And then this yellow, the gray, and the black tend to be just supplementary. There's no relationship. I don't think it's appropriate to call it monochromatic, analogous, or complementary. So that's just a little bit about the orange and teal colors. And I think overall, even though they're all very different, they work together. Nothing feels too clashy or ugly, more or less. I think my color model did a good job, and I was able to leverage the hard work another designer had done previously for me. Typography. So I used 3 main fonts here. The DIN condensed bold, the Helvetica Neue, and then the Minion variable concept. And you can see this is actually a little excerpt I've taken from my infographic here. DIN condensed bold was typically used for titles or subtitles, or even little tiny standalone paragraphs. Helvetica Neue was used for paragraphs, longer paragraphs like 5 to 7 sentences. And then Minion variable concept was also used for subtitles occasionally that needed extra flair to it. I had to do my best. The DIN condensed bold was very easy. My typography model was very, very blurry, so it was hard to match fonts exactly. I'm not sure the Minion variable concept semi-bold was the right one, but it looks pretty good, and I think it's close enough to the model that no one's going to question it too much. But that's an area where if I had a magic tool or a wand where I could improve my infographic, doing a deeper dive into the fonts would be something that would be interesting for me. Moving on to labels. So I have kind of three main types. Here you can see I have a thin pointer line and then a black rectangle with a white text in the center. Same is used with this bar chart below. The exception being that this doesn't go all the way to the center. It stays on the outside, whereas this goes all the way to the center of the marker. Looking back, this seems like a discrepancy that I would like to change. I'd probably have these go to the center to match up. But other than that, I like the look. The color reminds me a lot of like referees, and it feels on theme to the football concept. Another type of labels I did was similar. It's a thin leader line, but there's no actual label around the text. It's just free floating. I believe this is what you would kind of describe as an annotation. And then even one layer more abstract is just the text annotating with no leader line. The thing that associates it with the graphic is simply just the proximity between the two. So the balance between those three, I think, adds for nice variety. This is obviously taking up a lot of real estate. Thus, not every single label is in a black rectangle with white font, because that would probably become very overwhelming to the reader really quickly. Even pulling off this graphic without making it overwhelming to the reader really quickly was difficult for me, which is why you see some of these simpler little tiny leader lines that are just hugging the font. Some have tips, some don't. Looking back, I would probably also align these to be the same. I would love to have kind of 3 main exact categories, and there's a little bit of variation across these, which I didn't even notice until I pulled everything out and put them on the slide, and I was like, whoa, there are some discrepancies there. So again, those are areas that I would like to improve, and then maybe upon making those changes, that I might feel like it becomes a bit too monotonous, and these are small little subtle tweaks that are improving it. Who knows? So that could be something, if I want to tweak this in my own free time, that I could explore. Moving on to my visual language model. They look so similar when I put them on here. I'm pretty proud of the final product. So on the left here we have my model, and on the right we have my infographic. Just some high-level things that I've taken away from it. Of course, you see the use of solid lines all the way across as headers. You also see the solid leader lines for labels. You see my labels are very similar to their labels here as well. In terms of images or graphs, there tend to be no outlines. So you see there's no outline on the circle. I don't have any outline either. Trying to find another example of that. No outlines on the bar graphs. No outlines on the pie chart, the little man, those sorts of things. Another details, it tends to be very high, very abstract, so with little detail. You can see I've employed that as well. One variation I've had is I allowed for 2 photographs here. I have the brains, but the fact that I've filtered out the details, I think makes it a little bit easier and it doesn't seem like photography overload. Another change I've made is I pulled my brains out front in this top right graphic, whereas below, on the left here we see that the yellow circle comes on top of the man. And that was just something that I did because I think that the detail in the brains were kind of being removed away with the yellow, and I got enough feedback that says deviate from your visual language model because this is going to make it an easier viewing experience for your user. Another thing, so I talked a little bit about minimal details, and then this use of paragraph text. So they include, I think deliberately, these paragraphs to either add balance or really provide kind of supplementary information for the really avid learner. So I tried to do the same. Another challenge for me was not putting text everywhere. Theirs was so graphic heavy, and the focus of theirs was salary, so there isn't a whole lot of background information. Like, people don't need to be explained what salary means. But for CTE, I feel like there was a lot of background information that, going back to the concept of visual potential, that while visual potential was there, it wasn't enough to carry it on its own, that I wanted to include paragraphs because I wanted to give the user a very thorough understanding. So if you go to my website and see the first iteration, you'll see lots of paragraphs. So it was painful for me, but I slowly pulled them away and tried to reduce down like what is the essence of what I'm trying to convey. And this was the result, and I think it's better. If I had another week, I would probably play with this section a little bit more. Play with trying to introduce a little bit of teal maybe up here. Those would be future directions, I think, that would better align me with the visual language model that just didn't have time within the quarter to achieve. Visual hierarchy. So this is focusing on how does the individual consume the information. So I kind of applied 3 main techniques: size, color, and location. So the larger the size, there's a proportional relationship. The larger the size, the more attention I want to draw. So I really wanted people to know like what a healthy versus damaged brain looks like. I wanted them to see the players and the positions and understand that the linemen are taking the brunt of this. I wanted them to understand what CTE means and maybe get a better idea of the stages. So you can see those are all bigger pieces. I've also drawn color to the parts that I want people to look at. So bright colors tend to attract the eye, or unique colors. So I leveraged those as well. And I tried to really give an equal balance of all 3 of my kind of, I would say, accent colors. Another thing that's used for visual hierarchy is location. So up in the first kind of row, I have definition-based things. So what's CTE? What does a CTE brain look like? Cool. Have a basic understanding of what the disease is. Let's move on. What is the stages? What did the progression of the disease look like? Who is the most susceptible in that middle row? And then lastly, how is this impacting the sport of football? Are more people playing or less people playing? What level of play do you have to reach before this becomes an issue? So looking at high school players, college players, professional players, and seeing, it could start happening to a high school player. So all of that is kind of put into a hierarchy. Most important or foundational beginning information, intermediate information, and advanced information at the bottom. It's really meant to be read as a left to right, top to bottom, typical type of infographic. So unity and variety. So here I've just used this to explain the concept. So unity is what you say is kind of what immediately comes to mind. So things that are similar. So example that within my infographic is the color yellow. I've used yellow, you can see in 3 different locations here, which creates like a general theme. You can see that everything is more or less related under this central topic. But if I used only yellow as my accent color, more or less, that would become a very boring graphic, in my opinion, with the way everything else is laid out. I know there are other color models that employ one singular accent color and it looks great, but within the paradigm of which I'm operating, I think it needs variety, which brings us to our second concept. So I do have that theme of yellow, but I also bring out the oranges and the teals to keep the graphic interesting and well balanced. But if I didn't have that unity within the subset of colors I've selected, if every time I wanted a color I chose a new one, it would be really overwhelming for the user and they wouldn't quite know where to look, or they might say, okay, are these like shades of lighter blues, violets, all the same, and the reds and oranges and all the same? Like they're trying to encode something that's not there because you've given them so much freedom. So the same concept could be applied to the fonts. I've chosen 3 fonts that are used thematically across, and if I had only chose one font, it would have been really boring, and if I had chosen a new font for every single time I've written out a paragraph, the user would get whiplash trying to figure out what everything means. So yeah, I think color and font are the 2 main examples I have for unity and variety across my infographic. Layout. So in terms of layout, I have left-right symmetry. You can see I have one slightly larger column here on the left and a narrower, skinnier column on the right. My infographic itself is narrow and vertical, and I would say the individual sizes of the boxes are relatively similar, with this middle row being the biggest, but I wouldn't say that's enough to say that they're totally varied, because I think there is just kind of a general theme of size. Whereas I've seen other infographics that are like, wow, this little section is, 10 pixel by 10 pixel, and this one's 300 by 300. I don't think I have that dramatic contrasting that other infographics tend to have. In terms of alignment, you can see that actually all of my text and my graphics are left aligned in here. That was what was employed by my model. It was fairly simple, not a lot of variety. You could see it's really playing into this concept of columns, these 2 main columns, and if we didn't have that left align, I think it would be harder to see since they are different sizes, and they've played a little bit with this continual header at the top, and then they break it up as it goes down. That's something they employed and I've replicated more or less. And so I think left align makes that work consistently and become less confusing for the user. And that is the majority of my infographic. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion, and I'd like to thank you both for a great quarter.